The males of the species get set to fight for the rights of being the daddy. It's autumn in the Dales and mating time as the new series Yorkshire Are You in the Wild continues in an hour. First, brand new inside St Paul's.
St Paul's, an iconic London landmark and Britain's most famous cathedral.
Anybody who knows London knows that there's something about St Paul's.
For centuries, this extraordinary building has been the church for the people. St Paul's is where the nation gathers for our most important events. It hosted the biggest fairy tale wedding the world had ever seen.
People were hanging off from roofs and balconies, and you just knew she was approaching because the roar was extraordinary.
It is here that we've said farewell to our most famous leaders. One who united the nation, Winston Churchill.
I've never seen so many kings and queens all looking on us. Marvellous sight.
And one who divided it.
Waste of money!
As Britain's best-loved cathedral, it became the building the Nazis were determined to destroy.
There is a real moment of crisis here. Is this the moment where St Paul's Cathedral is about to be consumed by flames?
St Paul's is more than just a church. It stands for the spirit of an entire nation.
St Paul's is for us. That's what it's always been. That's what it always will be.
In July 1981, London hosted the most extraordinary wedding of the century. After years as the world's most eligible bachelor, heir to the throne Prince Charles had finally found his future queen, Lady Diana Spencer.
It was a huge event in 1981. The prince and heir to the throne was marrying this virginal, beautiful, young bride.
It was a global occasion, and it put Britain, put London, put the UK firmly on the map for 24 hours.
This would be a royal wedding like no other. In a major break with tradition, it wouldn't take place at Westminster Abbey, but in a building that had never hosted a royal wedding. St Paul's Cathedral. Prince Charles himself had decided that he wanted to marry in the biggest and most iconic cathedral in London. St Paul's is the masterpiece of architect Sir Christopher Wren. It was completed in 1711 and has been a defining part of the capital's skyline ever since.
St Paul's is a beautiful building, and you can't walk past it or step inside it without having your breath taken away. It's beautiful. It's simple as that.
St Paul's can hold 3,500 guests, nearly twice as many as Westminster Abbey. Charles could now have a bigger wedding than any that had gone before.
If you want to put on a big show, St Paul's is a big place that can take a big audience. It's got those lovely steps up to it. It must have looked like a good stage set in which to play out the perfect fairy tale marriage.
And St Paul's location in the east of the city would allow a 2-mile procession from Clarence House, giving the crowds a chance to see Diana on her way to the altar.
There was a sense that it would be a flamboyant setting for a flamboyant Camelot-like wedding.
But what St Paul's didn't offer was a happy history of royal weddings. One royal couple married 500 years ago in the old St Paul's Cathedral that stood here before Wren's building.
The last royal marriage to take place in St Paul's was Catherine of Aragon to Prince Arthur, who was Henry VIII's elder brother. And though they were two 15-year-olds, an arranged marriage, they'd only have met a few days beforehand.
But the ill-fated marriage was over shortly after it had begun. Just a few months after the wedding, Arthur was dead and Catherine was a widow. She would later become the first of Henry VIII's 6 wives.
So really, it wasn't a terribly encouraging way to forecast a marriage.
This bad omen didn't worry Charles. He had long wanted to marry within Wren's striking building. Diana, meanwhile, was determined to make her own statement in the huge venue. She commissioned David Emanuel to make a dress that would turn heads.
My partner at the time, Elizabeth, my ex-wife, and I were totally blown away and immediately grabbed a tape measure. And once we found out where it was, we raced up to St. Paul's. There was no way. This is a vast building. You couldn't do a very low-key, subtle little number. It had to work with the location.
Having done their research, the Emanuels wanted to design a royal wedding dress that was bigger than any other and wouldn't get lost in St. Paul's enormous nave.
We had found out, I think the longest royal train was 20 foot. We told Diana this information. I said, well, you know, St. Paul's is vast. We need to make a statement here. What about 25 foot? Yeah. Yeah? Yes, she said, great. I said, we'll make it 25 foot.
As the wedding day drew near, a team of seamstresses hand-stitched 10,000 sequins onto Diana's dress, and thousands of servicemen and women began rehearsals. But at the heart of this huge event were a bride and groom who had not enjoyed a normal courtship.
It was not widely known or appreciated at the time that Charles and Diana scarcely knew each other. They hadn't met very many times. She did not share his interests at all, intellectually or socially, and it was something that rather overwhelmed her.
Diana had also begun to worry that Charles wasn't in love with her, but with another woman. And then, a few weeks before the wedding, she made a discovery. As Diana later told her biographer Andrew Morton, she found a bracelet engraved with the letters G.F. Gladys and Fred were the pet names used by Charles and his old flame, Camilla Parker Bowles.
Diana was furious and she threatened to call the whole thing off. And she went to see her sisters, and the sisters said to her, "Too late, Dutch," which is their nickname for her. "Your face is on the tea towels now, so you can't chicken out." So they basically told her to get on with it.
The night before the wedding, London was brought to a standstill as 500,000 people celebrated into the night. Meanwhile, at Clarence House, Diana contemplated the life-changing event that lay ahead of her at St. Paul's Cathedral.
She felt rather that she was a lamb to the slaughter.
St. Paul's in the City of London is Britain's most iconic cathedral. On the 29th of July 1981, for the first time in nearly 500 years, a royal couple were tying the knot here in one of the biggest weddings the world had ever seen. Heir to the throne, Prince Charles was marrying Lady Diana Spencer, and wedding fever gripped the nation. 3,500 guests began to file into St. Paul's Cathedral, among them numerous crowned heads of state. At the request of the groom, 3 choirs and 3 orchestras started to fill the cathedral with music. Among them that day was soprano Claire Brigstock.
The atmosphere in the cathedral, I would say, was very excited. I mean, you know, it was one of the biggest wedding ceremonies on earth. You don't usually get that many people packed into a church, let alone the millions and millions of people who saw it around the world.
Meanwhile, Diana set off on a 2-mile journey from Clarence House. The route to St. Paul's was lined with over 600,000 people, all desperate to get a glimpse of her.
all the people. I mean, people were hanging off from roofs and balconies, and you just knew she was approaching because the roar was extraordinary.
As a global TV audience of 750 million tuned in, Diana climbed St. Paul's steps in the biggest wedding dress in history. And then started the 3.5-minute walk down the nave. At just 20 years old, Diana was not used to being in the public eye.
She seemed very, very young to me. And it was must have been a huge stress for her at the age that she was, barely out of teenagerdom, to have the eyes of the world on her. And wearing this, big dress, huge train. So I really felt for her.
The eyes of the world might have been on Diana, but she was scanning the vast congregation for just one person. The woman that she feared Charles was still in love with.
And then as she walked down the aisle, she was looking out for Camilla Parker Bowles, and she spotted her. And she, as she later said to me, she just hoped that, that whole episode in Prince Charles's life was now over.
As the wedding vows got underway, Diana's nerves began to show. She got Charles's names in the wrong order.
I, Diana Francis.
I, Diana Francis.
Take thee, Charles Philip Arthur George.
Take thee, Philip Charles Arthur George.
And I thought it was delightful. There was a little chuckle. And you know what? It made it more real.
As the couple emerged onto the cathedral steps, the nation celebrated. But the fairy tale was not to have a happy ending. Behind the spectacle, was this a couple marrying out of duty rather than love?
We all wanted to believe that this marriage was about two people in love. But the fact is, it was almost the last of the arranged marriages.
And St. Paul's Cathedral has not hosted a royal wedding since.
It was almost about business, not pleasure, about putting on a great national show. And that's why it had to be St. Paul's. So, hate to say it, but St. Paul's kind of symbolised what was wrong with that marriage.
For over 300 years, St. Paul's has stood on Ludgate Hill, the City of London's highest point. In 1666, the Great Fire of London destroyed the old cathedral that originally stood on this site. The St. Paul's we know today rose from the ashes, but the distinctive dome structure continued to make it vulnerable to fire. It is formed of 3 domes, with a complex wooden structure supporting the outer shell. And on one night in 1940, fire would have brought the dome crashing down, had it not been for the actions of a group of brave Londoners. In September 1940, Britain faced its darkest hour. 1 year into the Second World War, Germany had begun a relentless bombing campaign, targeting British cities night after night. This was the Blitz, Hitler's campaign of terror designed to break the country's spirit. London was a prime target and was bombed for 57 nights in a row. And St. Paul's found itself right in the firing line.
St. Paul's Cathedral is the tallest building in London. It is an incredibly prominent landmark, and there is no way of disguising it.
St. Paul's iconic status also made it vulnerable. Hitler knew that if he destroyed it, it would have a huge impact on British morale.
The Germans would have known the propaganda value in destroying iconic buildings like St. Paul's.
But St. Paul's wasn't about to succumb to Nazi firepower. A dedicated team risked life and limb every night to protect it.
Some buildings, like St. Paul's, really took this upon themselves. They weren't going to just sit and wait for the fire brigades to come during the Blitz and react to raids. They wanted to proactively protect these buildings.
The St. Paul's Watch were a group of volunteers, most of whom were too old to be called up to fight.
They were really doing something quite perilous and quite dangerous, but of course they are all volunteers. They care deeply about this building.
On the 29th of December 1940, the St. Paul's Watch would face their greatest challenge, and London would suffer the most ferocious air attack of the Blitz.
And in the run-up to the 29th of December, there had been a slight lull in the German bombing over the Christmas period. On the 29th, that changes, and the Germans launch a massive strike.
At 5:20 p.m., British radar stations picked up enemy aircraft, heading straight for London. At St. Paul's, the Watch prepared for the worst. The first wave of German bombers arrived just after 6 p.m. Over the next few hours, a staggering 10,000 firebombs fell in the streets around the cathedral.
The scale of the raid is huge, and it's devastating because of the number of incendiary bombs which are dropped, which start fires.
St. Paul's took several direct hits, and the Watch knew that if the wooden beams of the dome caught fire, the whole structure could collapse.
The worst-case scenario was that the entire building could become, consumed by fire and burnt to the ground.
Inside, they worked frantically to put out the incendiary bombs as they fell. But outside, a new threat was developing. A firestorm had taken hold in the streets surrounding St. Paul's.
This becomes known as the Second Great Fire of London. It is that bad. That much of the city burns. St. Paul's is now deeply threatened. This is a moment of extreme peril.
At 9:15 p.m., Lambeth Fire Brigade headquarters received a phone call. It was the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill. His message, St. Paul's was to be saved at all costs.
St. Paul's would have been the most obviously iconic building, and Churchill immediately recognised the significance of that.
If that had been destroyed, I think Churchill realised what a blow that would be to morale.
On Churchill's orders, extra firefighters were called up, but the situation was becoming hopeless.
The scene around St. Paul's on that night of this raid is one of complete devastation. The fire brigade has been unable to tame those fires, and there is a real moment of crisis here. Is this the moment where St. Paul's Cathedral is about to be consumed by flames?
In the middle of this chaos was Daily Mail photographer Herbert Mason. He'd spent the night on fire watch duty on the top of the newspaper's building. Like any good photographer, he kept his camera close. And he kept his eye on one particular building a few streets away. As the first glimmer of dawn appeared, he would take the most iconic photograph of the war.
The wind picks up, the clouds clear, and you're able to see for the first time the level of destruction at street level and the level of destruction that is then framing the one iconic building that has survived.
The smoke would drift a bit here, and then he'd raise his camera and it'd cover it back up again, and he waited for exactly the right moment.
Mason's photograph would forever define that moment. It would tell the world of the night St. Paul's survived the worst firestorm of the Blitz.
That is an iconic, amazing, breathtaking photograph. You've got this firm stone structure rising up out of it all and effectively saying to Hitler, get stuffed. We survived. This is the worst you can throw at us and we're still here.
As dawn broke on the 30th of December 1940, Londoners began to emerge from their shelters. A scene of devastation lay before them.
I think the scene of those empty shells of buildings would have been shocking to people, to see the ruins, the smouldering wrecks of familiar streets. There amongst all of them is a damaged but a surviving St. Paul's.
The fact that St. Paul's remained standing was hugely important to everybody. My mother was in the East End of London during the Blitz. She remembers waking after one night of terrible bombing, standing there embarking, seeing St. Paul's. On the one hand, she was horrified there should have been so many buildings in between that had gone, but on the other, St. Paul's was still there.
Hitler had failed to destroy St. Paul's, and he'd failed to break British morale. The cathedral would stand defiantly on the London skyline throughout the war and beyond, a permanent reminder of Britain's courage and resilience. And 24 years later, the cathedral would host an extraordinary send-off for the man who had fought so hard to save it, Winston Churchill. St. Paul's Cathedral, born out of the ashes of the Great Fire of London. For over 300 years, it has stood proud on London's skyline. During the Blitz, it had survived 71 Nazi attacks, thanks to the courage of ordinary Londoners and one man's determination not to let this iconic building fall.
Churchill said it had to be protected at all costs, and somehow it did survive, and it became a symbol of sort of national defiance and national unity.
And when victory was finally won in 1945, Winston Churchill and St. Paul's would be connected forever. Both had stood strong in the face of immense peril. 20 years later, on the 24th of January 1965, Winston Churchill died and the entire country mourned.
I think through Sir Winston Churchill we're living today, don't you? Through his courage and leadership. I think Winston Churchill was probably the greatest Englishman that ever lived.
There's a sense that Churchill belonged to the entire nation by 1965. So when he died, I think there was a sense of the nation to come together to purge that pain from World War II.
This extraordinary man needed an extraordinary funeral. Churchill's send-off had been planned in secret for over 12 years. It would be a huge state funeral modelled on the Duke of Wellington's in 1852. And its secret code name was Operation Hope Not.
Now, of course, the very dignified and upright chaps who were charged with this sort of thing were very embarrassed that they were having to plan the funeral of the great man, so they came up with the name Operation Hope Not.
There could only be one venue for the occasion, St. Paul's Cathedral. Churchill would join other national heroes, including Lord Nelson and Wellington, who were honoured with a funeral here.
St Paul's is where the people who have achieved something have their funerals, and so I think it's very fitting that the People's Church of St Paul's is where he should have waved goodbye to his great United Kingdom that he loved so much.
Over 7,000 servicemen would take part in the funeral, but 8 Grenadier Guards would have the ultimate honour and responsibility of carrying Churchill's coffin. The coffin was lead-lined, and together with Churchill's body, weighed over 1/4 of a ton. And St Paul's presented them with a particular problem: the 24 steps leading up to the Great West Door. Commanding the bearer party was a 23-year-old Lieutenant Anthony Mather.
We went there every evening, about 10 o'clock, literally going up and down, having a break, going back up and coming down again.
One of the bearers was Lance Sergeant Lincoln Perkins.
You're following another person in front of you. You cannot see where the steps are, so you've got to feel with your feet.
The biggest fear was that the heavy coffin might slip and crash to the floor.
The worst case scenario is that it slips on the shoulders. Because of its weight, we had 2 what we call swingmen who pushed upwards on the way up, basically to stop it slipping.
On the rehearsal, of course, it was plain sailing, and it wasn't until the actual day that things did change.
At 9:45 a.m. exactly on the 30th of January 1965, the bearer party loaded the heavy coffin onto a gun carriage. Ahead of them lay a 2-mile-long procession and the cathedral steps.
Drums were uncovered, bang, music was playing, and this is when we saw how big it was going to be, with the crowds 8 deep.
My very first memory is going to Churchill's funeral. I was not yet 3, and my dad, though a lifelong Labour supporter, wanted to pay his respects to this great war leader, and the whole family went. And I remember the crowds and the cold and just being overwhelmed with the scale of it all.
There must have been thousands and thousands lining the route. You could definitely hear people sobbing.
At St Paul's, representatives from more than 110 countries took their seats, followed by the Queen. This was the first time she'd attended the funeral of a commoner.
This is the biggest funeral, state funeral that Britain has ever seen, and there were 3,000 people inside St Paul's, a lot of them dignitaries, as you'd expect, foreign leaders. You had the current President of France, de Gaulle, kings and queens and lords and ladies.
At 10:45 a.m., as 900 million people tuned in on television and radio, the bearer party lifted Churchill's lead-lined coffin from the gun carriage.
We knew then that we were in the difficult phase.
But things were about to get far more difficult than even they had expected.
And so off we set up the steps.
The first flight of steps we encountered, no problems at all. And even I thought to myself, but this is good. This is what we retrained for. This is what all the rehearsals were for.
It was towards the top of the second set of steps that somebody in front stumbled.
And we were at an angle, and I can remember the coffin slipping back. I think we all must have realised there is a problem, and we did feel 2 guys buckle in front.
The 2 swingmen came into their own. They immediately saw what could happen, and their hands were on the coffin.
As if it was not for the two people behind us, that coffin would have slipped off a lot more shoulders. Frightening. And I was heard to say out loud, "Don't worry, sir, the Grenadiers have got you." And
with the steps behind them, the bearer party carried the coffin the 70 metres down the nave, past the congregation.
we did a manoeuvre to turn inwards to face the congregation. And that, as they say in the modern day now, wow, you didn't realise, not in my life, as a young guardsman, never seen so many kings and queens all looking on us, on the coffin. Marvellous sight. It'll stay with me.
As the cavalry last post was played by a trumpeter high in the whispering gallery, the nation was united in sorrow and gratitude for its greatest wartime leader.
It's an opportunity to just stop, for everybody to remember that conflict from the 1940s and to think about what could have happened, perhaps if Churchill's leadership hadn't been there to steer them through, and as a moment to remember that and to be thankful for him and what he did.
For more than 1,400 years, people have worshipped at this site on Ludgate Hill. But St. Paul's has always been more than just a church. At times, it has changed the way we think as a nation. Less than 2 months before Churchill's funeral, St. Paul's hosted a surprising guest preacher, one of the most important figures of the 20th century, a man who changed the way we think about human rights, Martin Luther King.
Now is the time to make justice a reality all over this nation. Now is the time.
On the 6th of December 1964, 4,000 people arrived at St. Paul's to hear Martin Luther King give a guest sermon. All the seats in the building would soon be taken, and hundreds would stand in the aisles.
When Martin Luther King came to St. Paul's, I mean, he was a hot ticket. It was standing room only, because people knew of the things that he'd been doing in America.
Among the congregation was 16-year-old Garth Hewitt.
There were crowds. I mean, it was full. I got the sense it was very important for people to see him. That's why they were there. That's why they'd made the effort to be there.
He was a celebrity. People wanted to see what all of the fuss was about.
King preached a message that America wasn't always ready to hear, that everyone should be equal whatever their race. He'd been arrested and jailed numerous times. It was a bold move for St. Paul's to invite such a radical figure, particularly as race was also a controversial issue in the UK.
What you have to remember about 1964 is that this was an era of the signs outside houses saying, you know, no blacks, no Irish, no dogs. So these were really, really difficult times.
A hush fell on the crowd as Martin Luther King stepped up to the pulpit.
So he climbed the steps at St. Paul's very slowly. And he gave his sermon very deliberately in that very defined southern drawl. And people were absolutely entranced by it.
For me, when he suddenly was there in the pulpit, which is quite high in St. Paul's, it was a powerful moment.
The sermon that King delivered would deeply move all who heard it.
He was speaking quite slowly. Yeah, and he got me. And he kept that rhythm going, I think. You know, I've heard a lot of sermons. There's very few I can quote like I can quote his, and we're going back an awfully long time. So I think he had that impact, that resonance in his voice.
When the service was finished, King walked to the cathedral's chapter house to speak to the waiting press. He gave a stern warning to Britain about its race problems.
It is my feeling that if Great Britain is not eternally vigilant, if England does not, in a real sense, go all out to deal with this problem now, it can mushroom and become as serious as the problem we face in some other nations.
King's words would have an impact, and his visit to St. Paul's would help shape people's lives in Britain for generations to come. But while King's visit brought the public together, nearly 50 years later, St. Paul's would find itself at the center of an event which divided the nation.
Waste of money! Waste of money!
As Britain said goodbye to its most divisive leader, Margaret Thatcher. St. Paul's Cathedral in the City of London is the place where Britain remembers its heroes. Beneath the cathedral lies the biggest crypt in Europe and the burial place of national heroes like Nelson, Wellington, and St. Paul's own architect, Sir Christopher Wren. In 1965, the nation was united in grief as Winston Churchill received his grand send-off here. And nearly 50 years later, the cathedral hosted another extraordinary funeral for Margaret Thatcher.
You turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
She had been the longest-serving British Prime Minister in 150 years.
Thank you, High Warrior. That's lovely. Thank you.
And was the first woman elected to lead a major Western power. Her policies had transformed Britain.
Margaret Thatcher, as a politician, marked a change in the winds in the upper atmosphere. She turned the page in lots of ways.
At 9 a.m. on the 17th of April 2013, 2,300 guests began to take their seats for her funeral. As the gun carriage travelled towards St. Paul's, there were echoes of Churchill's farewell ceremony. But this was a funeral unlike any other. On the roofs near St. Paul's, snipers took up their positions, while 4,000 police officers formed a ring of steel around the city, in the biggest security operation since the London Olympics. Among the crowds, some had come to pay their respects, while others had come to protest her legacy.
It was quite a long journey for the hearse to undertake, and therefore that's the exposed, open, public bit where someone could, in theory, have lobbed a smoke bomb or a bag of excrement or something like that, and could generally have done something that was a bit upsetting or a bit, of a hooligan element, I suppose. That was the biggest threat.
News of Thatcher's death 9 days earlier had led to celebrations among those who disliked her and her policies.
It shows you how raw the wounds were from her 10 years in office and how much damage she did to communities and how much hatred was still there.
And there was more anger to come when it was announced that Thatcher was to receive a ceremonial funeral with full military honours, and that the taxpayer would foot the bill of £3.2 million. Thatcher herself had taken a key role in planning the funeral, along with a group of dignitaries known as the True Blue Committee. Nearly 4 years before her death, it was agreed that the venue would be St. Paul's, the burial place of our national heroes.
You've got to bear in mind the people who were running the government at the time that she died. It was David Cameron, George Osborne. These people, they owed an awful lot to this woman. They looked up to her, and although she wasn't a hero to lots of people, the government of the day wanted to say that she was one.
A grand send-off at the People's Cathedral might suggest that the nation would unite, but Thatcher was to divide the country in death as she had in life.
But the idea that the nation could come together as one to say farewell to this great leader, that's simply not true, actually. There were lots of places who have very different memories of Margaret Thatcher, and I wonder what it was like for them to see a nation mourning, as it were. I didn't think they felt like mourning particularly.
As the day of the funeral arrived, thousands lined the streets. But unlike Churchill's funeral, they weren't all there to mourn.
Waste of money! Waste of money!
As the cortege passed Ludgate Circus, hundreds of protesters turned their backs.
Baggy, baggy, baggy!
At St. Paul's, the Queen arrived to attend the second funeral of one of her prime ministers. The other had been Churchill's.
I was lucky to be sitting quite close to the aisle to see the Queen walking with small bird-like steps, her eyes obviously darting around all the time, taking in what was going on. It was organised as a great occasion, and it felt like that.
The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit be with you.
In the end, the day passed without an arrest. The only things thrown were flowers. But Thatcher's funeral, in the place where we remember our national heroes, continued to divide opinion.
Having the occasion at St. Paul's elevated Margaret Thatcher above the rank of just another successful Prime Minister. There have been lots of successful Prime Ministers, and very, very few of them ever had funerals at St. Paul's.
By elevating her to the status of having a ceremonial funeral in St. Paul's, you're elevating her legacy, you're elevating her importance, and you are brushing out, airbrushing, if you like, the controversies around her.
St. Paul's is no longer the tallest building in London, but it still dominates the city's skyline. In fact, it exerts extraordinary power over the growth of the city. The cathedral has 8 protected sightlines, meaning that new buildings can't obscure views of St. Paul's. The People's Church remains much loved and fiercely protected.
But St. Paul's will continue because there's no way any government would, same as Churchill, wouldn't ever let it fall.
Like the British people, St. Paul's had withstood the ravages of a world war and has come to represent resilience and courage.
I look at that building and see it as a great survivor. This building has a spirit of its own, and that spirit for me is survival.
It's this spirit of survival that provides a sense of hope for the nation, whatever the future might hold.
St. Paul's is for us. That's what it's always been. That's what it always will be.
Next tonight, it's Autumn in the Dales, where it's more like an Indian summer in the new series of Yorkshire, A Year in the Wild. Brand new over on 5 Star, spellbinding drama continues with The Magicians. And on 5 USA, Rosanna Arquette guest stars as the new season of Law & Order Special Victim Units continues.